Hey everyone, welcome to the somewhat intermediate modeling tutorial section of our series on Intro to Blender. Today we're looking at a model that was sent to me by a student. The initial reason why the student sent it to me was because there was an irreparable glitch that we had run into in the lab where there was a piece of geometry stuck inside the student's bottle and we couldn't select it for any reason, no matter how we toggled the mesh. I managed to get the file at home, extract that mesh, do a little bit of minor cleanup to make sure that the file was usable and in a decent state, and sent that file back to the student as you see it here. Now, I happen to like the way that this model looks in terms of a starting point in order to do some more advanced modeling techniques on it. So if that student is watching and the rest of these students are watching, feel free to follow along and kind of use some of the techniques you learned here to execute your own unique modeling style. I'm going to be going a little nuts with this, so again, I expect everyone to kind of do their own thing. Don't just copy this step for step, because that's not really learning. You're just, following those directions that I'm showing you. So I would prefer that you take the things that you learn here and kind of innovate with them if possible and when possible. But I can show everyone how to take this and turn it into more of a classic beverage bottle shape, and then we can go from there. So the first thing I'll do is I'm in edit mode. I'm going to grab this ring here. And the way I did that was I went into edge mode, and before I clicked on the edge, I hold down the Alt key and it selects the entire ring. Now I can hit Control B and pull back on the mouse, which will bevel that edge. And if I scroll up on my mouse wheel, you'll see it'll insert a bunch of cuts in here, which give it this really nice contoured shape. I want to turn off my snapping because I had that on by default. I'm going to select this top ring here, and I'm just going to scale this out. And already we're getting a very interesting and unique shape that we don't see very often. So I'm going to bevel this edge as well with Control B and just kind of round that out. And now you might be asking, well, how can we get better control over this area? Because this area is a little bloated by comparison to the rest of our mesh. So there's this cool little key down here that you can use, or option down here, called proportional editing. If we turn that on, and I select this edge and try to scale, you'll see this white ring shows up. And as I scroll my middle mouse button up and down, you'll see it actually affects an area of the geometry. So that's a good way to get your geometry under control. So there I'm creating more of a classic beverage shape. Something like this perhaps might be reminiscent of some beverages that you might be familiar with. Proportional editing also works with movement as well as scaling. So as you can see here, I'm moving that portion of the bottle up and down. You can get some really crazy shapes this way. I'm actually going to turn it off for this version, or this movement that I want to do. I'm going to take this edge here and just dissolve it. That way we have more of a gradual shape there. And then I'll take this edge and bevel it. Whoops, I used a wrong version of beveling there. We'll talk about that one later. So for this video, I'm just going to be going through some different modeling techniques and kind of talking over the top of it to give away some pointers in terms of understanding how we can best manipulate our meshes to do what we want. I'll also be talking about how to hollow out this object. So this might be an example of a place where you might want to stop if you're going for replicating a more classical drink, beverage, bottle, container sorts here. So there we have our classic bottle shape. You might be familiar with certain brands that use bottle shapes that are similar to this. But for me, I'm not happy stopping at the normal. I need to go a little crazy and do some unique stuff. So I'm going to show you how you can use proportional editing to create some very unique ideas. So I'm going to pretend that I'm a designer who's working for perhaps an alcohol company or an upscale beverage company of some sort, and they do some very strange and unique, whoa, careful with your movements there, sometimes things can get thrown out of whack. To reset that, all I did was right click and it set it back to the state before I tried to do the operation. But anyways, like I was saying, I'm pretending that I'm working for this beverage company that does all sorts of crazy and exotic bottle designs. And so for this one, we have this potion looking bottle that's sitting on top of this pedestal like object here. And that's what I want to go for with this example, just so you can see something a little bit different, I suppose, and see how I might approach doing something like this. So we've discussed all of the hotkeys that I'm using at this point. So really I'm just repeating different operations, scaling, I'm sliding edges. So that's G twice, tap G twice, and you can slide that edge. And I'm beveling things and I'm moving things around. So you have a lot of opportunities to be able to manipulate even some relatively dense geometry. This was a medium level of quality here in terms of the mesh that we're dealing with. Sometimes I don't exactly know what to say. I'm just continually refining this shape here. I think I want to take this and kind of move that in a little bit. Take a look around our mesh and make sure we haven't messed anything up. Maybe scroll this one, slide that one down, grab this, bevel it, just to give some smoothness there. And you can see how I'm trying to keep my edges relatively uniform. They don't have to be perfectly uniform, but it helps to have a relative sense of uniformity about your edges, just to kind of, create a good contour to the object you have. We talked about topology at the beginning of the class and my little presentation there. It's available in the PDF if you'd like to check it out again. But that's important because we need to make sure that we have a good flow to everything. Otherwise, our objects will not be well defined. So maybe I want to put some ridges in on this thing, or I don't know, shape the bottom part of this to be a little more delicate so that there's a nice contrast in the contour of the object. So this can be pretty useful here. I'm going to undo that one, grab this part here and just scale that, control down. Something like that's starting to look pretty interesting. Take this, turn proportional editing off, slide it up on the Z. I'm just constraining all these parts here. So I want to take this bottom face and I want to snap it to the grid. So I'm just going to turn on my snapping and absolute grid alignment snapping and make sure this, if I come into an orthographic view, you can see is moved off the grid for some reason. Let's undo that. So you can see our pivot somehow got moved off of the bottom of our object and it's floating. So the way to fix that is if we select this bottom face, we can hit Shift S and say cursor to selected. Hop out into object mode and use this really hefty hotkey, Shift Control Alt C, and say origin to 3D cursor. And what that'll do is if we go back into our side view, you can see everything has moved up to the bottom of our object, and now we can move it down, turning on absolute grid alignment on so that we snap directly to the grid. And then I need to quickly click this object here, make sure it's selected, hit Control A, and say apply location and rotation and scale. I'm just going to turn on my screencast keys. I forgot to turn them on at the beginning. I apologize for that. But again, the hotkeys that I'm using are Control B for beveling. I'm using Control A to apply any of the transformations that we make. I used double tapping G twice to slide edges. Control R to add in edge cuts, and middle mouse wheel here also works to add in additional cuts. I'm going to cancel that. And I think that's the majority of the hotkeys I've used so far. So I'm liking the way that this is turning out. I kind of want to round this edge right here because it's a little sharp. Something like that. Maybe round this. That's looking good. We'll maybe round this one out a little bit and bring this in. So I'll turn on my proportional editing. And we'll just bring that part in and maybe this part here too. Slide that edge down. There we go. So I'm just scrolling up and down on the mouse wheel when I have proportional editing active, and now I'm just going to disable it really quickly. I'm starting to like this shape. So now you can see we have this bottle that's being held by this little pedestal thing, and we're going to pretend that this is an actual alcohol container or a beverage container. It doesn't necessarily have to be alcoholic, but this is what I think of. So we work for a company that does somewhat upscale bottles that are ornately designed for unique purposes, and they wanted to create this kind of fancy, ornate bottle that all of this holds liquid, but it's designed to look like some sort of set piece, perhaps. So now we're going to take a look at hollowing out this object. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete this top face. And you might be asking, why is there all of this weird shading going on? And I'm going to address that in a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to describe to you the operation that we're going to be doing. So now that I have all of these faces selected, we want to come down to our extrude option in the tools panel, and I open that using the T key. And once I found that extrude operation, I want to come down to region vertex normals. All right, so we're going to use the region vertex normals option here. And what that's essentially doing is it's looking at the direction each of these vertices are facing in, and it's going to extrude based on that. So I can actually show you what that looks like, and that will help us understand what's going on with the shading here. If I select all these faces, I can come down to mesh display and turn on normals, so our vertex normals. So as you can see, all of our vertices are pointing inside, which means all the shading for our bottle is actually happening on the inside of our bottle. So what that means is if I come over here to shading and UVs, if I flip the direction, you can see now that it was because our bottle was flipped inside out that we had those shading errors. So this bottle was actually flipped inside out. Now we actually want that. That's advantageous for us because we can actually use that to our benefit. So come up here to the tools panel, find the extrude option here and extrude by region vertex normals. So now if we pull inwards, we can see we get some depth to this, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to turn off our display here, shut that off, close this N menu, T menu, and now we can see we have a bottle that has some thickness to it. It is a 3D printable bottle because it's entirely closed off. We can take a look at that here. So the inside there is that extrusion that we made. The outside is the, of course, outside surface. And you could technically fill this with liquid all the way to the bottom here. And so we have our ornate bottle. Now, I want to talk about fixing some of this shading here. So we should really quickly come over to our object data tab, make sure we have our object selected, and click auto smooth. And we have a degree angle set to 30. And basically what that means is that if there's a change in the surface that is under 30 degrees, such as this, it's a very gradual change around the surface here, it's going to smooth out all the shading. If there's an angle that's greater than 30 degrees, then it's going to create harsh shading. And that's why we have some good separations between various surfaces that we have here. Let me close that anim player. I don't know why that was running. All right, so now the next thing that we need to do is let's take a look at our modifier stack, which is under this little wrench icon. We can throw on a subdivision surface modifier. And what that'll do is it will just apply a little additional smoothing to our mesh. Just keep in mind that it's also going to crank up the faces count that we have. So if I turn that off, we can see we're a little under 3,000. If I turn it on, we are now at 41,000. That's quite a bit. As long as we're, below 50,000 really, or even the hundreds of thousands, we should be okay. I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup here. So I'm going to select the edge here as well as the one on the inside to be consistent so we don't get any clipping in our model. And I'm just going to bevel that slightly, and you can see that that actually helps crease out that edge there. I can soften this edge in here. Some of this might be a little difficult to see. I apologize. This is something you get used to if you become familiar with a lot of 3D design. I do this all the time. And then I can come up to these top edges here, and we can kind of bevel those just to add a little bit of highlight to the rim of our bottle here that catches light in a very pleasing way. And then again on this one on the inside here, we can bevel that as well. Here we have both. Yep. And there we go. So now we have some very nice detailing. We can actually do some interesting things here, like add a bevel there, select this middle edge and scale it in. And now we have an additional level of detail there. We can also do the same up here in certain areas. Maybe we wanted to add this here, maybe move that down a little bit. And you can see how you can very quickly start to build up some detail in our objects. I can even start to come in with proportional editing. Now those were very shallow surface details, so I didn't have to select through the mesh because you see we're not even close to intersecting here. So you can get away with certain things like that. Just be careful not to go too far because you'll run into problems where you have mesh intersections and I don't want that. So you can see on the bottom, excuse me, we have a star pattern that's occurring here, and that's because of our subsurf modifier. But the reason that's happening is because we have this big unresolved n-gon on the bottom of our bottle. So I'm going to select the bottom face as well as the inside face, and I'm going to hit the I key and inset that. I'm going to do it again, and then I'm going to do a last one. And now what we can do is we can go into edge mode and select these two edges and just move them up. Seems like did not select the inside. Did it not work? Oh, yes, I did not select this one here. Now if we move it up, we shouldn't run into any intersection problems, although it seems like we might have a slight one. There we go. And then grab this face in here. Let's undo that movement. Grab that face and this face below. Nope, I didn't get it. There we go. It's a little hard to see sometimes, even when we're using the wireframe mode. Just be aware. And there we go. We have a little bit of a recess in the bottom. We turn that modifier back on. You can see that the star pattern has been greatly reduced. Now that might be useful for the bottom of a bottle, you know, a soda bottle that you might be familiar with. A lot of them tend to have that star pattern on. So although it's unintentional, it may work in our favor. I'm going to grab these two edges because they're looking kind of harsh, and I'm just going to bevel those out a little bit. I'm not going to go too far because, as you can see, if I go too far, we're going to intersect with our own geometry. We don't want to do that. So I'm just going to bring it in just a tiny bit and make sure, double check to make sure that we're not intersecting. We're good. Deselect that, switch back into our shaded mode or solid mode, and there we go. So I'm pretty happy with the way this has turned out. It's a very interesting looking bottle design. And as you can see, it didn't take me very long to do that, the tools that we have available to us. Now, of course, I have quite a bit of experience using the tools, so take your time and kind of work through it. Make sure you undo, make sure you're using your constraints. I think that's something that I saw people were struggling with. So when I hit G to move an object, we can get some really unexpected results. But if I want to move it straight up and down, I hit the Z key to constrain. You can see this blue axis will show up. I can hit the X key to move it forward and back, and the Y key left and right, and then right click if I don't like any of the movements. And then if I do like where it's moved, say I want to move this up, I can left click and accept it. So those are just some tools that you need to get used to. One thing I should mention about the subsurf modifier is that if you want to export this object and upload it to Sketchfab, or if you want to send it to me for the project, make sure you apply your subsurf modifier. And then when we go into object mode or edit mode, you can see that we've added all of these polygons, and it is relatively dense, but now it'll actually work. If you don't add that modifier, so let me throw that back on here. Set that like this. So if you don't add this modifier, what'll happen is it'll disappear and you'll only have this, which isn't bad. In fact, we could use this for a lot of things here. This is actually quite good geometry, but if we wanted to use this as like a hero model in a movie or something, if we knew that the camera was going to get very close to it, then we should, of course, add the modifier. So it's nice and smooth and we have all the detail. So I'm going to leave it on for mine. And I'm not going to apply it yet. I'll wait till I go to export it. But if you're going to export your file and send it, then make sure that you actually use that option. So I'm going to open up a new scene and I'm going to show you some other really quick modeling techniques. So I know some people had trouble understanding how to poke holes in their meshes if that's what they wanted to do. So let me create this mesh here. So let's pretend that this is a wall or something and we wanted to make a hole in it. There's a couple ways we can do this. I'm going to duplicate it so we can look at it twice. So the first way to do this is kind of simple. What we do is we create a bunch of edge loops. So again, Control R, scroll up on the middle mouse button and then click, and then it'll ask you to place it somewhere. So right click to leave it in the center. Repeat that same operation. So we roughly have square shapes here. That's about square. And so now if we want to create holes at each of these intersections, what we should do is we should switch to vertex mode and turn our mesh into wireframe and just select all of these vertices in the middle. Now here's a little trick here. If we hit Control-Shift-B, we can actually bevel out our independent vertices into polygons. And then we can, of course, connect those. I don't think it'll bridge them all. Yeah, so if you see, if we tried to bridge it all, we get this really cool and interesting looking thing, but it's not what we want. We have some obvious geometry problems there. So what we can do is we can select them individually and hit Control E and bridge those edge loops. And now you can see we've created a hole in our mesh. We have also created some n-gons here. So these are n-gons and we need to take and connect these vertices. And now this is no longer an n-gon, n-gon, tongue twister there. These are no longer n-gons, these are actually quads. So we can actually solve that problem just by connecting these vertices. And I'm just doing that by hitting the J key, by clicking two separate vertices and connecting them. And then if I wanted to fix this one, I would have to add an edge loop here, line it up, take those two and connect them. So that's how you would do that. So I'm not going to connect all of these because that would take a whole lot of time and that probably wouldn't be very useful to you just to watch me, bridge all of these, but you get the idea. So there's one way to make holes inside your meshes. This is kind of the more proper way to do it. And then if you wanted to round them out, you could try to bevel the edges. It might work. So let's pretend that this is a portion that you'd want to bevel. So you could kind of round them out this way. And of course that would require a lot of cleanup. But if you're looking to make circular holes in your meshes, then I would suggest we use the Boolean method that I showed in class. And what I'm going to do for that is I'll create a cylinder. I'm just going to scale it up and rotate it 90 on the X. And we're just going to intersect it and say this is where you want to have the hole in your mesh. We're going to select the two and we can either hit join or use the hotkey Control J. So now that we've got our meshes intersecting, let's deselect everything. Hit the L key while we're over the cylinder in order to select all of the faces that are connected on the cylinder. And then if we hit Control F, we can come over to our intersect knife option and it'll add a nice little cut into our wall there. I can select the cylinder again with just L, and now I can move the cylinder, or I could delete all the faces. And you can see now we have a nice hole punched into our mesh, but we should take our edges here and bridge them with Control E, bridge loops, and there we go. We now have a hole in our mesh. And if you wanted to move this hole around after the fact, ideally it's better to do it before, but if you wanted to move it after the fact, you could select all of these points and simply move it like this. And you now have a hole that you can move around in your mesh. That can be very useful. Now, if you did multiple of these, you might run into a problem where this line kind of overlaps with another one, so be careful of that. Make sure you kind of plot out ahead of time how many holes you want and where they should be, and then punch holes into your mesh. Otherwise, you could run into some problems. So let's take a look at a more practical use for this. So one of the examples that I wanted to show you was I made a little cassette tape. And I assume that everyone in class knows what a cassette tape is. I can't imagine we're all so old that you don't know. But if that is the case, then feel free to check that out on the Google. This little joke there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the edges of this cube that I've squashed, and I'm just going to extrude them by our vertex normals to get them to come out about that far. And the reason why I did this is now I can apply our rotation and scale in object mode with Control A. Coming back in here, I can select the corner edges here, and then I can hit Control B, and I can bevel them back and round them out. And now we have a nice rounded beginning to our cassette tape. I'm just going to turn our shading to smoothing and turn on our auto smooth here. So now we can see the outside is nice and smooth, but the faces here are sharp. So the next thing I want to do is I want to grab all the top faces, make sure I have everything else deselected, and I'm going to inset. Now, I'm only going to inset about that far, and here's why. If I continue to inset, you can see that the corners are starting to intersect with each other, and we can get some really bad geometry. So right-click to cancel that, and just inset a little bit, say about there. And then what we can do is we can scale. And if we take a look at the top, you'll notice that because we're scaling and it's a rectangular shaped object, we have a little more space here than here. So let's compensate for that by scaling in the X only. And that's roughly about an even amount of space around the whole thing. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. So now what I want to do is I know that cassette tapes have a part where you kind of insert it into the reader, and there's a part that protrudes out, so I need to make some space for that. So I'm going to go into wireframe mode, hit B in order to grab my drag selection, and I'm just going to drag this down over here. So this will be the top of our cassette, and this will be where the little holes are for it. And let's continue moving right along, working on our cassette tape. So now what I want to do is I want to take these three faces here. I'm going to inset those just a little bit and bring them down on the Z. That creates a nice little indent for us. So if we hop out into object mode, we can see it's looking pretty good. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to grab these faces here, and I'm going to extrude by our vertex normals just a little bit. I'll take this edge here and kind of move it back. I'll take these edges here and scale them in on the Y just a tiny amount, just to create a nice little sloping effect there. And there we have the top of our tape. I might even want to take this and just drop it down a little bit so it's kind of angled there. That's starting to look good. And then I can take this face here and inset that. Again, don't overdo the insetting. If you have to, inset a little bit in scale, and then I'm just going to extrude it inwards. Stumbling over my words today. So now I'm going to scale it and make sure that we come in a bit so that we're not clipping with the wall of our mesh there. So scale it in. And there we go. We have the open part of our cassette tape where the tape would run through and the machine would read it. And now we need to add the holes for the spools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a cylinder. I'm going to make sure it has at least 48 or more vertices. Now I know I've showed you the cylinder in the past where we use only 8, and we're going to take a look at that a little bit later. In this instance, because we're punching a hole in our mesh, we want to make sure that it has a nice smooth outside to it. So we're going to be using this one that has 48. So I'm just going to scale this down, scale it up on the Z, scale it down a little bit more. And I think that's roughly about the size that I want. So now we're going to look at a modifier that will be helpful for us. So let's go over to the modifier stack and throw on a mirror modifier, and you'll notice nothing's happening. Well, that's because our cylinder is in the center of the world. If I move it, nothing is also happening. And that's because in object mode, we're moving the entire object and the pivot, which is this little orange dot here. If I go into edit mode and move the object, you'll notice the pivot stays there. If I turn this back on, if I switch from X to Y, now we can see that the mirror modifier is actually working. So make sure that when you're moving your mesh, if you're planning on mirroring things, you do it in the edit mode instead of in object mode. Otherwise, you're going to run into a problem. And that looks about right for what I want. Maybe make these a little bit thicker in their radius by scaling on the X and Y axes without Z, so they don't move up and down. Whoops. So there we go. Shift Z as I scale. And I think that should be good. So now what we want to do is select both of these meshes and join them. Whoops. What I forgot to do, however, was apply my mirror modifier before joining them. Now I can join them. And then, of course, because we have our meshes selected, we can again use the Control F menu and use our intersect knife tool. And we can select both of these meshes, delete the faces for them, and now we have those little holes for our cassette tape. So now what we need to do is select the faces and, of course, bridge our edge loops. If I select these two faces and hit Shift R, that's another nice little hotkey. It'll actually repeat the operation that we did there. And now we can select these. We can inset them just a bit. We can extrude by our vertex normals. And now we have our little tape spools there. So now we have to add the little teeth that go on the inside of the tape spools that the machine grabs a hold of in order to spin one spool and wind onto the other side. So we're just going to insert a basic cube here, and we're going to scale it down, of course. We need to change the dimensions so that they're somewhat thin because they're little tiny teeth. And if you were planning on 3D printing this step might not be necessary because I don't know that the 3D printer would be able to deal with such small detail by comparison to the rest of the model. But that's about what I want it to be. So say something like that. And now we can position this, say, right about there, perhaps. And so I'm just going to push this edge in a little bit. Take this entire mesh here, again, we can use L for that, and just drop it down into this area here. So if we go from the top view, we can see kind of want to line it right about there. And then it seems like we have some floating vertices here. That's weird. I don't know where those came from. What is that? And it looks like our tape is clipping through the bottom edge. So if we just grab that edge loop by holding Alt, we can actually just pull that up, angle it in a little bit so it's not clipping through the mesh. And we'll take a look at it in wireframe mode. Let's bring this one down a little bit. There we go. It's a bit better. We can also grab this face and the end faces because I know there's 3 of them. And I can scale that in X to Z0 to flatten it out. And let's see. Where were those extra those extra vertices? Well, it doesn't seem to be causing any harm at the moment. And it also seems like we have some over here as well. I suspect that that could be some sort of leftover thing from the mirror modifier possibly, but I can't imagine why or how. Let's see if we can get it edge. It doesn't seem like there's anything there. And the same with vertices. So it looks clean aside from being in the face mode. So I apologize. We got a little derailed by that. It's unusual. You see new stuff every day, apparently. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this cube here, and I'm going to slide it on the y-axis, just like that. And then I will move these on the x just to get them lined up. So now what I can do is I can hit Shift D as I have both of these selected, and I can right-click to leave them in place. Hit the R key, and now we can scale, but I don't want to scale, or I mean rotate, and I don't want to rotate around this direction, so I need to change my pivot point, although it should be working properly, and now it's not. That's weird. So I have this set to median point. It seems like I'm running into some problems, so I'm just going to fix this manually. If I move my 3D cursor here, I can switch my pivot point to the 3D cursor, and now I can rotate like this on the Z-axis by 90. I can duplicate again, right-click, rotate on the Z-axis by 45, and hit Shift-R. Oops, undo that. Shift-D, right-click, R, Z, 90. There we go. So now we have those little teeth inside our cassette tape. There's a couple of weird faces that are now appearing here. Let's delete those. And that's starting to look pretty good. Now we're going to obviously have to make sense out of these little teeth in here. So what we should do is we should take all of these teeth using the L key to select those meshes, and we'll hit the P key and separate them by selection. I also want to make sure that they're nice and centered up. It seems like they're a little heavier on this side, so if I click the mesh and hit G, Y, so I can move it on the Y, we can center it. There we go. That's just me being particular. So now what we can do is we can again hit Shift D, right click, and move this mesh over. Let's again look at it from the top. Make sure we center it up, and that's starting to look pretty good. So now, if we wanted to make these a part of the mesh, again, be careful with 3D printing because these are pretty small pieces. But if we wanted to make this all part of the same mesh, we can add a modifier called Boolean here onto the tape itself. And then we need to make sure that these are a full object. So we'll hit Control J to merge those, then selecting the tape, and then using this button over here to select our cubes. We can see that the Boolean operation worked, but we need to switch it to union. So now this is all one mesh, hit apply. If we go into object mode now, what we need to do is hide the second set of cubes that was created. So you'll see here we have a second set of cubes. So now if we're just focusing on this object, we can see that those cubes have been merged into the mesh there. And they're one solid object that's watertight. And that's what you need to do if you were one of the 3D printing people. Make sure your mesh is one solid mesh and is watertight. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do is I kind of want to put a nice little inset part here. And that becomes important because I'm going to show you how we can take a low poly cylinder and use it to create high poly details. So we'll come over to this mesh section here and create a cylinder. I'm going to set the cylinder to 8 vertices. I'm going to scale it down a bit. Look at this from the top, go into wireframe mode, and I'm just going to kind of line this up right about there. And then scale it down. Oops. Let's change our pivot point to active element. That way, whatever we're selecting is what we're going to be doing our controls around. I kind of want to make this a little bit smaller. And I'm paying attention to these endpoints here and making sure that they would encompass around these points. Maybe make it just ever so slightly larger. All right, so now that I've done that, let's go into edit mode and delete the caps, which are the end faces of a cylinder or another object. And then we can just delete those faces. And then I'm going to select these two opposing edges and tap the V key. I apologize for that. My computer likes to complain every now and then. Some of my drives go to sleep and wake up and make that sound. I apologize. So now that I've tapped the V key, I can move this edge around. I'm going to right click to reset it. And now we have two halves of a whole mesh. I'm going to use the L key to grab this one and move it over here. Paying attention to the number in the bottom corner, we can see I've moved it about 0.65. So I'm going to undo that, hit GY 0.65 on the keyboard and enter that. Deselect it, do this one, GY negative 0.65. And there we go. We've placed everything in order. Go into edge mode, select those edges, hit F, make a face, do the same over here. So now, as you can imagine, if we tried to use this to cut our mesh, we would have these very jagged edges. And if that's what you want, that's fine. You're free to do that. But I want to smooth this out. So what I can do for that is I can hit the W key and open our specials menu and hit Subdivide Smooth. And you'll see it actually adds in extra divisions, but I need to dissolve these edges here. Because I want this section to be flat, I'll select it again, W, Subdivide Smooth. Again, select the extra edges that we don't need. This time there's more of them. Dissolve them. And I want to do it one more time just so we get a very nice smooth mesh. X, dissolve edges. There's one more. Shift R to repeat that dissolve edge. So now what we can do is we can smooth this out using our smooth shading, although it's not going to make much of a difference. And then we need to join these two meshes together. Control J. Whoops, I want to, let's see, how do I want to do this? Control J, it'll make a mess of our tape, that's okay. Let's come back over here and turn back our auto smoothing back on. Now if we select that cylinder that we used, we can again hit the Control F intersect knife option here. Use L to select the cylinder and dissolve those. Delete those faces, I should say. Now we don't need the edge that was created on the bottom, so I will dissolve those edges. Now I'll switch into face mode and grab these faces. I'll inset them slightly, just like that, and bring this down. And now you can see we've created this nice inset. You'll also notice that there is a slight issue that we're running into with our cassette pieces there. So let me just undo this. If we were to just extrude this a little bit, the way we would solve this is if we took this edge here and this edge here, and then we turn on our snapping to vertex mode. We can actually move this down and align with that edge there. And then we need to come into vertex mode, hit the W key after we've selected everything and say remove doubles, and you'll see we've removed 96 vertices. If you remember, that cylinder had 48 faces going around it. So the reason we removed 96 is because we were aligning with those 48 edges, not faces. I apologize. So now if I wanted to edit this, you can see that this top part is a little thin, so I'm going to grab that ring on the underside of the tape spool. Do the same here with the Shift key and Alt key, and I'm just going to drag it down a little bit, maybe even line it up a little bit with the edge of that. And you do the same thing to the bottom face here. G, Z, and bring it up. I'm going to right click to cancel that and turn off my snapping. And there we go, we've added some thickness there. And now we have a pretty detailed little cassette tape. So there are some practical modeling methods there if you were trying to get, an object that's a little more common. We could use this now as some sort of a hero prop because it is pretty detailed. I'm not going to use the subdivision surface modifier on that because we're going to run into a lot of problems. I can show you really quickly how that's going to look, and you can see there's a whole lot of mess going on here, and it kind of falls apart. And the reason why is because our geometry is kind of forced in this case, so we have some pretty big n-gons all around here. You can see that this is a huge n-gon. These edges aren't really connected to anything. Some of these edge flows don't make sense, but if we're looking to 3D print this or just make a prop of it that'll sit on a table in a video game or a movie or something, we could totally use this. It is watertight, so you could definitely 3D print this. As you can see here on the inside, that's the geometry. It's all one solid piece, so that would work. The last thing I would probably do is select all of our faces and hit Control T just to triangulate everything. I know that looks kind of scary, but when we switch back out into solid mode, boom, it's perfectly fine. That'll just afford us a little more control if we were to upload this online or give it to a 3D printer. They wouldn't have to worry about the mesh changing at a later point. It would be exactly what you'd expect it to be. And so that's how you would create a little cassette tape if that's what you wanted to make. You can see how we've applied those modeling methods. So now I'll loose you to the world. Come visit me for the next video where I'm going to talk about lighting setups with our bottle that we've created here. I'll show you how to light this thing in an interesting way. And of course, we'll go through some render settings. We'll go through saving out our files after we're done rendering and assembling everything into a folder and zipping that up. And then we will also take a look at some materials in a later tutorial where I will show you the mailbox file that I've put together and how I got all the materials working in that. And I'll leave a little download link in the description of that video. So feel free to join me for that. I hope this information is useful to you, and I'll see you later.